Hello once again and welcome to my beginner tutorial on how to create a Halo Custom Edition map. This time we're going to be working with Halo scenery. Now last time we finally got to the point where we had a nice custom looking map. It had hallways and tunnels and all sorts of really decorative nice stuff in the walls and in the ceilings and floors and whatnot. But there's one thing you'll notice that was severely missing. If you go through the campaign in Halo or really any multiplayer map, you'll notice explosive barrels, you'll notice weapon holding devices, lamps, and all sorts of other weird things like that. And it's quite obvious that these objects aren't part of the map. At least they aren't welded to the map in that sense. These objects are, for the most part, scenery objects in Halo. Just like scenery in a movie, they're put there for several reasons. To look nice, if you want to repeat something in multiple maps, keeping a common theme, like you have the same boxes in one map as in another. You can also imagine these basically as the scenery objects you place in Forge if you played Halo 3 up till the newest Halo. So without further ado, I'm going to start showing you the basics on how to create that. It was a bit harder to pick out the scope for this tutorial as opposed to the others, as there's so many things you can do with scenery. So I'm going to start out with basically static scenery. Just here's something you can look at, it looks very nice. Move on to animated scenery so that you have something that can move in the background, something that might be really decorative or like a clock or something like that. And finally move on to sound scenery, which is invisible scenery basically that you can't collide with and can't hit or whatever, but it emits sounds. So you can have weird creepy crawly bug sounds in your cave if they enter a certain area, stuff like that. One amazing part about working with scenery is that it doesn't have to deal with the rules that we had to deal with in making a level. So in making a level, you realize that, for one, our standard box map, we know it's an editable mesh, that you take all of the normals and flip them, and you backface cull, and that's our standard box map, right? Well, for scenery, the equivalent would be, well, just a box. These boxes have their normals facing the opposite direction as the map, so it's actually much easier to imagine what it'll look like, because instead of acting as if you're inside the level when you were modeling levels, you can kind of just look at this and say, oh, well, this is a box, and when it renders in my map, it'll look like this. Another rule it doesn't have to follow is that usually in the past we've built our maps in one solid piece. So something like this would be unacceptable, at least with what we've dealt with so far. With scenery, what I'm going to show you is that from the start, we're going to easily make two parts to one scenery, and it's not going to really require that much more effort. In fact, two-part scenery can look really nice, especially when you start animating it, and it's the foundation of how you create stuff like doors, where parts of the door will slide apart. And finally, there's a way to simplify the collision model such that if you make a very complicated looking scenery, you don't have to deal with that really complex object when it comes to bullets bouncing off of it or the way it hits walls in your map and things like that. Instead, you can simplify that down and save tons of time. If you make a complicated map, on the other hand, what you saw in the last lesson was we had to fix all the errors. It had to be completely sealed, and a slight change in decoration could cause a huge amount of errors that you have to really look out for. For scenery, it's a lot more forgiving if you do it the right way, which is what I'm about to show you. Okay, so enough of that talking, right? Let's get on with it. The first thing I'm going to do actually is import our usual scale, because I really want to know that I'm doing this right here. Okay, with that imported, we see that our box is at a pretty decent scale. We didn't want it to be bigger than our level, for instance. So what I'm going to do first, however, is I'm going to take this box and make it a bit more advanced looking. Because like I said, I wanted to make something that was very complicated looking, but actually very easy to export as opposed to a very complex looking level. So let's go ahead and make it a poly to start out with. We'll change it back to a mesh later. I'm going to select all of these vertices and I'm going to chamfer them a bit. Let's select the top face right here and let's inset that. These are all techniques that I've shown in the last lesson if you're just joining us. And let's go ahead and extrude this up a bit. Now this would actually export just fine because all the things I've done have been just manipulations of the sides, so there aren't any holes I've made or any weird polygons. So let's try to make something a bit more complicated. Let's do this. So there we go. All I did was I added a ring to the top here. And if we do the typical border check, we see that there are indeed some open borders all over this ring I just added. And I'm going to completely ignore that because I won't need to solve these for our scenery. You'll see why in just a moment. The next thing I'm going to do is get rid of Master Chief because he's just kind of in the way, sorry. And add a second part to our scenery. This part is going to be a sphere. Now, for those of you who watch the bonus parts of my tutorial on video, as opposed to the text ones, you would have seen that we tried to make a completely spherical map, and that didn't work out so well. There were certain considerations we had to do for Halo's rendering engine that it really didn't like perfect spheres. However, as I've said many times, scenery gets to break several rules. So we're just going to have a plain old sphere right here. Now I'm going to skip over applying materials to this scenery because it's pretty much the same procedure as applying materials to a level. However, in a level you're going to have to put plus sky, even if you don't use the sky. So if you have a indoor map, you're not going to use the sky. It's all going to be purple and sapien, you're never going to see it, but you still need that plus sky material. With scenery, you don't need a plus sky, so you can go ahead and just give yourself whatever type of material you're going to use for that. So yeah, just apply that, not a big deal. I'm going to convert both of these back into editable meshes. I'm going to select all of the polygons in one and make sure they have the right material. The only reason I'm doing this really is to make sure that there are no errors on exporting, because the exporter will still look for some sort of material to find on them. And you can see that these are set to 2, so I'm going to make sure they're all set to something that's actually defined. With that, I'm going to name these something easy for me to see. Simply top and bottom. And now I bet you're wondering how I'm going to export this. After all, we have 2 completely separate objects, and we only usually use 1 frame. Well, in consideration of the animation we're going to do later on, I'm going to directly make 2 frames, and I'm going to name them appropriately frame bottom. Copy this and call this frame top. I'm going to link the top to the top frame and the bottom to the bottom frame. But I'm not done yet. I have to make yet a third frame that Sapien's going to use as the center point for our entire object. And this we're just going to call frame. The main frame, which is just called frame, should be placed right in the center of your scenery. The reason you do this is because when you place it in Sapien, it doesn't really care what your object looks like. It just wants to know where that point is that you call the center. So if you define it to be all the way 1,000 miles to the left of your scenery, you're going to be placing it very awkwardly in your maps. So try to get the main frame as close to your map as possible. I'm going to press H to bring up my hierarchy here. And you can see I can double check frame bottom contains bottom, frame top contains top. And if you don't see this, you can go ahead and just click display and display children, and you'll see this just fine. I'm going to click both of my frame top and frame bottom. Select and link both of these to the frame. If I don't select anything and then press H, you can now see that frame contains frame bottom, frame top, and each of those contain the parts of my scenery. This should be the hierarchy for your scenery as well. Obviously, if you're using just one part to your object, you're not using a two-piece object, two-piece scenery, go ahead and use just one frame. You don't need to split it up. But if you're making a multi-part scenery, this is the way you should do it. With all of this complete, we can now export it. And you'll see no errors up to this point. Let's go ahead. I believe I created this folder. So go ahead and create a scenery folder. Let's make a new folder for this and call it Beacon. And that's what I decided the scenery will be. Inside here, make the familiar folder models, but also make the folder physics. Now obviously I'm skipping over the texture of it because that would take extra time, and really I'm just showing you how to do scenery. But for your scenery, remember to make a bitmaps folder and go through the usual process of turning those bitmaps into textures. In the models folder, go ahead and save whatever you want to call your scenery. I'm just going to call it Beacon. You'll see it exports fine with no problems. And now we come to an interesting piece in our tutorial. We need to create some physics for this object so that it knows where to bounce off bullets and etc. But we have this weird thing with an open edge, we have this perfect sphere, and Halo doesn't like either of that. I'm going to go ahead and save this right now as Beacon Look, and then save a copy of it as Beacon Feel. As you may have guessed, Halo treats how the scenery looks and how the scenery feels as two different things. So what we can actually do now is take this, mess with how it looks, going to that multi-res, and shrink it down to something that Halo can deal with. Then we can go here and actually completely delete it, but first let's go here. Let's make a pyramid, right? Then I will delete our top box here. Take this pyramid, convert it to an editable mesh. Take the top vertex. I'm going to go ahead and chamfer that a bit. Take this top here and pull it up. And now we've created an object that we chamfered a vertex and we pulled a thing up. We never broke any part of it, so there are no issues with this. So it's perfectly valid halo material. We'll name it the same thing. So we have our top and bottom. We apply the material to the whole thing, and we double check all of these, make sure they're all set to 1. That's correct. Relink this to the bottom. Double check our hierarchy. Bottom is in bottom, top's in top. And we can now export this once more. This time go to your physics directory and save it the same way you saved your models, with the same name, except you add underscore collision after your name and before .jms. So we save this one as beacon underscore collision. Okay, now that we've exported it, we want to go to our familiar tool. And recall that with building levels, we use tool structure. In this case, we don't want to use that. We want to use something slightly different, tool model. The syntax for tool model is exactly the same. So instead of levels, we do scenery because we have data scenery this time. And we have our scenery object right here in beacon. So let's go scenery beacon. Give it a little while. There we go. Okay, so we remember that material I made, I just called nothing. We're also going to call this shader model because this is not an environment. It's also not transparent or glass or whatever. So we're just going to make it a model. It's going to say failed to import whenever you define this. This is totally normal. Just rerun the exact same thing. Remember, you can press up on your keyboard just to get to the last command and rerun that. Okay, so we see here our detail level, our worst case vertices, worst case triangles. Computers have really improved since then, and this really shouldn't be a huge deal unless you're trying to make something very, very high definition. I've never made anything where these have to be different. So what this is basically saying is that no matter what detail level it's set to, it's always going to be the same. I'm not even sure what setting in game would change that, but like I said, it's not terribly important right now. Remember that we made our visual model, our what's going to be called the GBX model. We also made a collision model, so we're actually going to have to run this a second time, this time with the command collision geometry, using the same scenery beacon, so same folder. And notice that it immediately knows to look for this beacon collision.jms file. This is why you have to name it specifically with that underscore collision after it. Created collision model scenery beacon. So what this means is we can now go into our tags directory, into our scenery folder, and you'll see it created this folder right for us next to all the other built-in scenery. And here we have our look model and our collision model. You'll notice though that there's no actual scenery yet, so this is where Gorilla comes into place. Alright, new scenery. Now if you're following along with my tutorials, I bet you've never had to create your own tag. You've usually opened and modified stuff, but Gorilla can indeed make its own tags, and you can see all the different types of tags available to you. I'm not sure that all of these make sense to create from Gorilla. For instance, you can look at a scenario and scenario structure, but obviously you wouldn't want to try to use that through Gorilla, because most of that is processed through Tool. In this case, though, scenery is something we do want. We look at the options up here, and these are very self-explanatory. We have our model, so we're going to go back to that scenery directory. And use the GBX model. And go to collision model, same directory, and use our collision geometry. You'll notice if you try to do something, if you try to mix them up or whatever, that it'll turn red. So you'll know you did it right if both of these are black. You can also double check that these are the scenery models that you want. If you open them, you'll see these are pre-built with all these different objects. You can see first child node, frame bottom. So this is the model for sure. Our collision model. This also has our frame bottom. So everything seems to have made it just right. The next thing you need to bring your attention to is this bounding radius. If it's at 0, you can look at it, but you can't touch it. This is important because that means you can make scenery in the background that's completely invisible to the player. So they can shoot through it, they can see it, but it's not going to affect the game at all. What we want for this beacon, however, is we want it to exist. It feels really weird for close-up objects if you can shoot right through them without it having any real reason. So usually just use this 0 bounding radius for far-off objects like huge ships in the background that you still want to look 3D. When we scaled our model, you saw that I scaled it down to less the size of Master Chief. And what I've said before, and I will continue to say, is that a world unit is approximately the height of Master Chief. It's not a very intuitive thing for most people to start out knowing, so I'll keep saying that. Because of this, though, our scenery is smaller than Master Chief, so we just want our bounding radius to be 1 world unit. I'll show you later on how you can actually see that and adjust it if you have a very odd-shaped object that you're not quite sure the exact size of it. Now this render bounding radius, you can see it says if set, this radius is used to determine the object is visible, set it for the pelican. This basically saves resources on the person's computer. If you have a very large and complicated object, you can set it so that it doesn't show up until they're within 5 or 6 world units away from it. That way, if it's very, very complicated, their computer doesn't have to try to render it if it's a billion miles away. We're not going to set it because it will automatically be set for here, and it's not a very complicated object, so we'll leave that alone. With that done, we do Control S to save it. Let's go to our beacon directory, and we will name this beacon. And now we have our scenery tag. Let's go ahead to Sapien. Now, in order to test out scenery and stuff, you're going to need a map. If you have your map from the last lesson, that's great. I have created a map specifically for testing objects such as this. Welcome to Wild Render Laboratories. This is a little map I made. One of the perks of being a map maker is that you can make little things like this. At this 0 of the target here is the very 0 of the world, and every ring represents every point away from that 0 that is 1 world unit away. Therefore, you can easily test the power of weapons over distance. It's kind of limited to only a distance of 12 world units across, but that's still pretty large of a distance. Each of these lines on the wall represents 1 world unit, so if you walk up to it, you'll see it's just at your head, just like the height of Master Chief, as I said. So this is very nice for testing out scenery. So what we're going to do now is add our scenery. Oops. So you go to Mission, Objects, and Scenery, Edit Types, and then Add. And we see, I actually have been practicing this so it went right to it, but you want to navigate to your scenery directory, beacon, or whatever you named your scenery, and open that. If it pops up an error here, which it very easily can, it usually means there's something wrong with the tag. So go back into Gorilla, open up your tag, and fix that. There was no errors here, so we're going to say OK, OK, right click, and change this type to beacon. And there we go. You can see here we have our object. It's a perfect sphere, even though Halo usually doesn't like that, and yet it's still collidable, as I'm sure I can show you in game. You'll see the 0 point for this object is the same 0 point as we set for the frame, so that's why it's important where you place that. And you'll also see that it looks like our look model, as I've been calling it, and not like our collision model, which is exactly what we want. So this is how you can get really complicated looking objects into Halo without having to worry about patching up all the holes. I should mention, of course, that if you want to patch up all the holes and you want a very precise collision model, that's completely up to you. But keep in mind that you will have to make a collision model that obeys all these rules. So it may not be worth it at times, especially when all it's really going to do is make bullets bounce off it slightly more precisely. And bullets don't bounce off and hurt people in Halo. So I'm not sure that would increase the realism of the object. So, there's also if you walk into it. So make sure your collision model, that's one of the considerations, make sure your collision model represents the object you're trying to emulate. So you don't want to walk into a wall and be able to walk through the wall at some points and out of the wall at others because you messed up your collision model. So, match it up as close as possible. Ours might have a little bit of wiggle room because we taper it off towards the top. So we might be able to hit parts here that we shouldn't. But since it's such a small object, I'm not thinking that will matter too greatly. Now, this thing's quite interesting to look at, but it doesn't really do anything. It's nice for decoration, but it's supposed to be a beacon, right? So we're going to go straight into animating this thing. Usually I'd go into Halo and demonstrate how it works, but there's so many parts to building scenery that you'll love and appreciate more being able to test it straight in Sapien rather than exporting this map and booting up Halo and testing it there. Of course, you'll want to do that at least once to test the collision model eventually, but especially when you're creating tons and tons of scenery, you don't want to be booting up Halo every single time. It takes too long. So that's what I love about Sapien, is that you can see it works perfectly in game, and what you see is pretty much always what you're going to get. If you're concerned about your bounding radius, here's that trick. Type tilde, the same thing we used to type in radiosity, and use the command debug objects 1. And you can now see this radius around the object. Now you'll see my circles are a tiny bit off on the ground. They still match the edges of the ones, but they're a tiny bit off. But you also see that this one render bounding radius completely encompasses the object that we wanted to use. It's this circle right here. So if you're concerned that your render bounding radius or your bounding radius is too tiny, go ahead and use that command and you'll be able to see exactly how big that radius is and expand it accordingly. If you want to turn it off because you have so many objects and it's kind of cluttered, you could just put debug objects 0, and there you go. Now, on to animating. So here we are back at our look model. So this is the fancy looking model that is actually going to be rendered in Halo. And what we're going to do now is add a very simple animation to it. One important thing to note before we start is that the Halo engine will only really look at these frames here. It won't be concerned about your model when it comes to animations. What that means is if you were to animate something, say moving this part of the scenery back and forth, as far as Halo's concerned, these 3 frames are in the same spot, so you've done no animation. So what do? You move the frames. Because you've linked them together, if you've linked them appropriately, the frames that you move will move everything that's linked to it. So you see moving the base frame moves all the other frames, moving the bottom frame moves the bottom, top frame moves the top, etc. So I'm going to reload it right here. If you've never animated with 3D Studio Max, try to follow along. I will explain it, assuming you do not know how to animate. The first thing we're going to do is look down here. This is your timeline. You're going to want to put keyframes on this timeline that tell the animation where to go, basically. So at each of these 100 frames, it's completely still right now. I want to add a frame right here, moving the frame, of course. I want to put it up here. And because I clicked auto key, it's going to automatically set that as a keyframe from 0. You can go ahead and move these along here to wherever you want. So I'm going to move it down to 50. You see now it goes all the way up to 50. Go ahead and choose some kind of simple animation for your scenery. And when you're done, click auto key again, and that will stop recording. When auto key is on, it will automatically record any of your movements to whatever frame you're currently on. And right now we have 100 frames. If you don't know, the frame rate for 3D Studio Max is about 30 frames per second. It's like 29.97 or so, which means that every 30 or so frames, 1 second has passed. You can go ahead and click play and see if I were to count to 3 here. About 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. So you see about the pace of your animation previewed right here. What I want to do right now, though, is change this animation so about every second, let's put this at about 1.5 seconds. I want it to go here, but I also want it to go back down. And the way I can do that is I'll just put any kind of keyframe right here using the Z-axis again. The same thing of movement. Remembering to turn on auto key. I will right click this starting point and I want the Z position, which is the one that we're moving. I'm going to copy this value, go ahead and click through the keyframes to the 3rd frame and paste this value back in. Hit enter. So what this is going to do is that now when I hit play, it's going to go up at 1.5 seconds, go back down, and this produces a much smoother animation than trying to, if I were to put this up or down, it would just jerk back, and Halo will play it as such, so you'll get something that looks like, you get something that looks like this happening in your game. See how it jumps toward the end? So you can use this method, go back, and make sure that the beginning and end values are the same. So with that complete, we now have a nice little floating animation here. What I'm going to do next is click down here, time configuration. And I'm going to change it to 30 frames per second exactly. So I'm going to be syncing some sound with this scenery later on. So I want to really make sure that the amount of time that this animation runs syncs up with my sound. There are other ways to do that, but this is a nice, quick, and easy way. So 30 frames per second means that every 30 frames, 1 second of real time will have passed. So I'll set the length to 90, and that will give me exactly 3 seconds. So I'm going to go to frame 30. Frame 45 should be the half point, and that's where it is. So this will give me exactly 3 seconds of animation. Okay, now with our animation done, we're going to run a new tool. You're very familiar with the JMS exporter, the tool that we use to export our models for levels. This time we're going to be using the CAD Animation Exporter Compact. This is very specific for a reason. It's one of the few tools that still works with 3D Studio Max 2013. If you have a very old version of 3D Studio Max, there are some other tools you can use, but this seems to be the only tool I found that can work with the newest version of 3D Studio Max. And it looks like so. Let's export to a file. And we see in our Beacon folder, I've created a new folder called Animations. And I'm going to save it just as Beacon and leave it as a JMA file. You'll notice there are several other type of motion files, but JMA should work for our scenery just fine. You'll see it records it. That's all correct. So now we go on over to our Halo directory. Go ahead and open up Tool, and this time run Tool, Animations, Scenery, and the name of your scenery, just like before. You'll see Model Animation Compress Save 0 bytes. So here's where things get a tiny bit complicated. You're going to want to go to Gorilla, go and open, find your scenery, and open that Model Animations. When they updated 3D Studio Max, it broke several tools. You're going to need to do this in order to work with multi-part scenery. You can skip this step if you have a single frame, so you only have one part to your scenery. This is for trees and stuff like that. We have 2 parts, so we're going to have to do this trick, and we have several frames. What this trick involves is going to your Model Animations, scroll all the way down, and you'll see this thing called Node List Checksum. Go ahead and open your model, and you'll see the same thing at the top that says Node List Checksum. Now here's the problem. If these two aren't the same, this 14649 does not match this 3251, then when we import it into Sapien, it will say that the animations don't match. Too bad, you can't use this animation. So how do we fix this? It may come as a surprise, but the files you've been exporting from 3D Studio Max this whole time have actually been text files. So if we go over to beacon.gma and we go ahead and open it with some kind of text editor, Notepad will work as well, you'll notice near the top 14649, the exact same number that we found here. You're going to want to change that to the same number that's in your model. So we have 3251, and that's what we're going to change it to. Go ahead and save it. Remember to close these so that Gorilla doesn't interfere. Then go ahead and rerun the animation command. If you reopen your animations file, go ahead and verify that the node list checksum has indeed changed to the number you want. I also noticed that I managed to mess up my collision data along the way, so I'm going to go ahead and recreate my collision data. Remember, that's just collision geometry. I'm going to recreate my scenery that I messed up during the tests. So now we have our model, our animation graph, and our collision model. I'm going to go ahead and save this now again as our scenery object. Let's go to Sapien. Let's go ahead and add our beacon back to the scene. If you still have your beacon in the scene, you just have to refresh Sapien by closing it and reopening it. Let's place it in the center. And there we go. Doesn't that look very nice? We have ourselves a constantly animated. Let me click out of here. Let me fix that and then click here. We now have a constantly moving animated object here. Very, very cool. Very interesting looking. We're now going to move on to the final step for this lesson, and that will be adding sounds. So here we are in Audacity. I chose Audacity because it's very free and very popular, and I believe most of you will be able to adjust to it quite quickly. It's not that difficult of a program to use. You're going to want to put whatever sound you want in here. We just want a sound effect for now. But this process is the same for any sounds you want in Halo, really. So go ahead and put it in the tracks here. This will match up perfectly to my animation and pulse right at the top there. Using some fantastic Windows tricks, let's see if we can't do that. When you have a sound that you are happy with, go ahead and save this out. I'm going to save the project, sure. I'm going to save it as beacon, boom, and let's export. You're going to want to save it as, you can save it as OGG or WAVE, but I prefer WAVE actually, because the method we're going to use today is, again, one of those methods that still works to this day. I've tried exporting sounds by myself, and it is a very, very frustrating process. Luckily, we have a tool here provided by the wonderful modding community that is going to make our life a lot easier. So you can go ahead and save this thing as a WAV file. I'm going to go ahead and save it in my sounds directory in a new folder called Beacon. So we have data, sounds, beacon. Put whatever you wish here and export it out. Okay, now it's time for that tool I told you about. The wonderful modding community has produced for us the Halo CE sound converter. It severely saves so much time in making sounds for your maps. So thank you very much to the Click Team, Custom Curtis Sounds, TLS Udi, Nerve Booger, and the Bink entire company, SDK, etc. You guys make a very awesome tool. I'm going to put a link up to this in the description below. You're going to want to take all these files, every single one of them, copy them, and put them in your Halo directory, which I've already done here. Go ahead and overwrite anything it asks to overwrite, because they are just updated versions of them. Oddly enough, you're going to run the 2.exe file. And you're going to get a nice little intro here. Go ahead and click in Converter. Select the sound file you want to use. We're going to open our beacon.wav file. Go ahead and play it to make sure it's right. That's correct. There's a 1.5 second delay, and then so that's correct. Put the file name you want here. This is for the resulting sound. We're going to leave it as beacon. Actually, let's call it beacon pulse. We're not working with the Xbox, so leave it OGG Vorbis, OG Vorbis. And you see here, you see some stuff here. Stuff's going on, going crazy. And we're done. Seemed kind of weird there. Nonetheless, go ahead into your tags directory, your sound folder, music, and here we go. Here's our beacon pulse. You also see, as I said before, I ran some preliminary tests here just to make sure this stuff would work with the newer 3D Studio Max and their tool. It did indeed. So here we have our beacon pulse sound in tag sound music. We're going to go to Gorilla. We're going to create a new tag, and this will be the sound looping tag. Go ahead down to tracks and click add. You can go ahead and make the gain 1. You don't want to fade in or fade out in this case. We're going to click our we're going to click our loop and make sure our loop is pointed to our sound here. So beacon pulse sound. Okay. Go ahead and save this out as a sound looping file. I'm going to create a new folder in my sound directory and call it loops. And go ahead and save this as beacon pulse. Now then, go back to your scenery. Open up that tag. You can go on down to attachments. Go to sound looping on the type. And go ahead down to your looping sound over here. Now we're going to go through these. Go ahead and open up that looping sound again. And open up your actual sound item, your sound tag. And we're going to want to set these to something reasonable. Minimum distance, the distance below which this sound no longer gets louder. So you want to set this to some sort of distance that's reasonable for your sound. We just have a little beacon here. So we want it to start fading away. We want it to stop getting louder at 2 world units. Then we want it to be quiet after 5 world units. So the way I take this is from 0 to 2 world units, it'll be loud and it will stay loud. Then after 2, it will start fading away to 5 world units, in which case it will be completely silent. So we want, if you're within 2 world units, you need to hear this thing. After that, start fading away, and then 5 world units away, you won't hear it at all. We can go ahead down to these. You can modify these as you want. I'm setting them to 1 here. I'm not going to change any of the skip fractions because that will mess with things in a way we don't want. And go ahead and save this as it is. Go ahead and save this. This should not have changed. This now has that. And we're all good on that end as well. Save your scenery tag. Close, and then reopen Sapien. Go ahead and save your scenario there. We've now successfully added a little pulsing beacon into our Halo world. So we're going to go ahead and place a couple more of these things here. Now, what's actually odd is the sound might get desynced just based on the placement of them. That's the frustrating part. There are other ways to sync up sounds to it, which we'll explore at a different date. Since I'm sure for your first scenery, I'm not sure many of you will start with something that needs to be so precisely synced up to some sort of sound effect. That's more for devices which are a separate type of, they're not even a type of scenery really, but I'll consider them that. Things like doors and elevators, that's a complete category that we'll cover later on, along with syncing sounds to those. So enough of Sapien, huh? How about we actually go in the game and see how these things work out. So yes, welcome to Wild Render Laboratories. Here's where we do all of our extensive testing inside of a nice, closed, measured environment. So here we go. Each of our really weird thumping beacons here. You'll see if we shoot them, they do indeed absorb bullets. And because we are able to separate our collision model and our look model, you can see that whenever I shoot the sphere, let's go somewhere here. Whenever I shoot the sphere, that collision model is taking those bullets, so you're not seeing them appear on the other side. But we can shoot whenever the ball isn't there. So we actually have some sort of moving cover in a way here too, which I find really cool. I hope you guys come up with something really nice to use for that kind of thing. You also see that we have a perfect sphere inside a Halo, breaking all the rules we've had so far. And because of our collision model, we can also jump onto this thing and ride it like an elevator. So these are just some of the cool little things that you can see work out with a custom scenery object. It's collidable. You can walk up to it, hit it. We didn't customize any of the materials. That's why it's plain white and acts like dirt, which is why there are no bullet holes leaving in it. So if you're wondering why no bullet holes, it's because of that. You can go ahead and add your own custom textures and it should behave as you expect it to. Okay, I do believe there's one more thing I'm going to show you right after this, which is how to create what is called a sound scenery object. Sound scenery object is just an object that emits sound but isn't visible. So now we're going to build some sound scenery Adding sound scenery is actually very easy compared to everything we've done before. Go ahead and create a new tag in Gorilla, call it sound scenery. And you'll notice it's exactly the same as a regular scenery object, which means that when you add sound, the process is exactly the same as if you had a scenery. So let's go down here, loops, and let's go ahead and I'm not even sure if you have to set the bounding radius for this. Let's go ahead and save this. I'm going to call this thump. Close that. Okay, so here we are in Sapien. We've cleared out all of our scenery, so it's perfectly quiet. We're going to add back our thump sound scenery. Put that right in the center. And what you'll actually notice is that you don't hear anything. This is normal. Go ahead and save that out, close it, reopen it. And there's that pretty loud thump. Okay. You see that we now have this sound there without any object being present there. Now what you can use this for is if you create a creepy crawly bug sound or flapping wings and stuff, you can hide these sound sceneries in caves, and that automatically gives you ambient sounds. There are other ways, there are other little settings you can set, like miss this many activations and delay this and all that, which will make it a bit more random so it's not just constantly flapping bats in one of your corners of your cave. But essentially this is how you'll be able to add some ambient sounds to your map. Good luck, good modding, and hope to see you next time.